Hello there, I'm LRJ Chess and we're back with more opening lessons. In the past video, we looked at the basics of opening strategy. The two most important things you learned were to control the center and to develop your pieces with threats. If you could do those two things already, congrats, you're already playing a great opening. But in this lesson, we're going to be looking at even more strategies that you can use to bring your opening play from good to great. We've talked about your pawns and your minor pieces already, but we actually haven't given much time to talk about your most powerful piece, your queen. That's why in this video, we're going to start out with the do's and don'ts of what to do with your queen in the beginning of a chess game. And believe it or not, the answer may surprise you. Let's get into it. A common misconception in the opening is that your queen must be developed very early on. It's your most powerful piece, and it can do a lot of damage to your opponent. That's why you'll see many beginner games like one of these two, where white chooses to move out his queen extremely early, and armed with only one other piece, tries to checkmate the black king. There is a problem here though, and if black knows how to recognize and stop white's threat, he'll be able to repel the attack and completely punish white for this basic and elementary mistake of moving the queen out too early. But you know better. And in this channel, and this video specifically, I'm going to teach you what to do instead. Your queen being the most powerful piece actually should have no participation in the very beginning of the game. And that may sound crazy, but if you instead focus on controlling the center, developing your knights and your bishops into the main part of the game, get your king to safety, which is something we'll look at later, and only then get your major pieces, your rooks, into the center and your queen into the game, then you'll have a great opening position. But if you mix up those steps and start with your queen, you're going to run into a lot of problems, such as these. Let me give you an example. So you know that your queen is your most powerful piece, which means your opponent will take every chance that they can get to attack your queen and try and capture her. So if you move your queen out early into the game on f3 or h5, trying to go for this quick checkmate, the scholar's mate checkmate, your opponent would recognize that. And your opponent would be able to develop their pieces to stop this checkmate threat, but also attack the queen, move after move after move. Since the queen is more powerful than a knight or a bishop or a rook, you know that you're not going to allow your opponent to take your queen. So they're going to develop a piece, attack your queen, and you're going to be forced to retreat it because you don't want to lose your queen. This in turn will give your opponent free development and an extra tempo. In chess, tempo simply translates to time. So giving your opponent extra tempo just means that you're giving them free moves and free time to develop their pieces and improve their position. That's the exact opposite thing that you want to do in the opening. One of the ways beginners usually create problems for themselves in the opening is by moving their queen out too early. They move it out, they make a checkmate threat or a simple threat on a pawn or something. That threat gets defended. The opponent develops pieces to attack your queen, and your queen just gets forced all the way back to her starting square. You'll have nothing to show for your queen's journey, and on the other side of the board, your opponent will have multiple pieces developed, all because they were attacking your queen. That is an easy way to get a quick defeat. That's something that I have done as a beginner, and that's something I know a lot of other beginners have done as well. So one of the best ways to just get better at the opening right away is not to do this. Just prioritize the development of your other pieces and controlling the center, and you'll be good to go. To really drive this lesson home and teach you why you don't want to move your queen out too early, I want to review one position that we already looked at, where white was threatening checkmate with queen takes f7. We're going to go over this position in more detail, and I'm going to teach you how to defend against the threat and how to take advantage of the queen being out too early. Let's take a look. So as always in a chess game, you want to make sure you know what your opponent's last move did. So white's last move was queen to h5, and this is the one that threatens queen takes f7 checkmate, because this is guarded by the bishop, So the queen and the bishop together would attack the king, and the king would have nowhere to go. It would not be able to move anywhere. It could not capture the queen because the bishop is defending, and it can't block the check. So white's queen makes a checkmate threat, and this is a really big issue. A lot of beginners here will play the move knight to f6, completely missing the checkmate threat. And the reason why is because they don't actually realize what the queen is doing on h5. They just see they can play a move that develops a piece and attacks the queen. While this does sound good, you always need to make sure you have an idea of what your opponent's last move is doing. You want to make sure you know what their threat is, what their plan is, or what they might want to do on future moves. This is not something that black did in this position, and many games have ended in this typical 4-move checkmate. I don't want that to happen to you. So let's go back to the position after queen to h5 and figure out what black should have done instead. Since we know that the white queen is threatening checkmate, we need to figure out how to stop that. So we could defend the f7 pawn by playing queen to e7 or queen to f6, or we could block the queen from looking at f7 by playing the move g6. We could also develop our knight to h6 because that would guard the f7 square as well. So we have 4 main ways to stop this checkmate threat. Let's look through each one of them one by one, and then you'll figure out which one is the best. If we move our queen, both queen moves do guard the pawn on f7, but what I want you to see is how both of them block your other pieces. The queen coming to f6 blocks your knight from being developed, and your queen coming to e7 blocks your bishop from being developed. So that doesn't seem like it really helps black's position all that much. If he plays knight to h6, it does develop a piece and stop the checkmate, but as you learned from a previous lesson, there's a little saying, knights on the rim are dim. And if you see from here, the knight's 3 possible squares aren't all that helpful in the future. It's not going to go back to g8 where it started from. It can't go to f5 because the pawn is defending that, and it can't go to g4 because the queen is defending that. So the knight doesn't really have a future here. Lastly, we come to the move g6. The reason why this is the best move is because it stops the checkmate threat. It blocks the queen from capturing this pawn. It can no longer do that. But it also attacks the queen immediately. And what that means is white will be forced to move his queen again. Once the queen retreats, now he's threatening checkmate again, this time from f3. So we can now develop our knight. The point here being the knight is blocking the queen from taking f7, and the knight's also guarded by our own queen, so white is not able to capture the piece. At this point, black has a pretty simple way to follow up the game. He can continue developing his pieces, and he also has very easy ways to attack the white queen. For example, let's say white tries to develop. He develops his knight. Black plays d6. He's okay with blocking his bishop because his bishop will have a new home on this g7 square, which will also add protection to the king when it castles on the king side. d6 also opens up the bishop to go to g4 in the future, which will develop a piece and attack the queen. White plays d3. Black plays bishop to g4, attacking the queen. The queen moves to g3, and black plays bishop to g7. I'm going to stop the position here, but notice how black has better development than white, even though they start second. White has 3 pieces developed, while black has 4. And black's going to prepare by castling next, eventually playing knight to d4, possibly, which threatens capturing the c2 pawn and attacking the king and the rook at the same time. And he can also finish by bringing his queen up 1 square and getting his rooks into the game. While white will always have to deal with his queen on g3 and the potential attacks that the black pieces can do against it. As you can see, nothing good comes from moving your queen out too early. Your queen can be developed once the path forward is protected by your other pieces and your pawns. Your queen should not be the first piece out because then it will be susceptible to a bunch of attacks by your opponent's pieces. Hopefully this example will show you why the classic 4-move checkmate is not something that you should be doing. People will get a lot of wins with it, but it doesn't help your chess, and overall, it's not something that you should play. Alright, so with that position out of the way, we've now covered the pawns, the minor pieces, the rooks, and your queen. Which means there's only one piece left over that we haven't really covered. And that would be your king. Your king is your weakest piece. And your king isn't going to be participating in the attack or controlling the center or being developed. Your king will need to be protected throughout the entire game. There are two main parts to a chess game: attack your opponent and protect your own king. Since the goal is checkmate, which ultimately is destroying the enemy's position and preventing their king from moving anywhere while putting it under attack, you need to do two things to win the game, which is exactly that, but also preventing your opponent from doing that. Whoever can do these two things better will likely win the game of chess. While your king may be a weak piece, he is your most important piece. Your other pieces can get taken, and you can still have a chance at winning the game. You could lose your queen at the very beginning and somehow still win the game. It is possible to do that. You just have to keep fighting. But if your king gets checkmated, the game's over. There's no more fighting on. You lose. The game is done. So hopefully this shows you how important it is to protect your king. Now, you want to protect all of your pieces, but just see the importance of the king over the others. With other pieces developed and guarding your king, it becomes so much more difficult for the opponent to attack you. They'll not only have to get to your king, they'll have to get through every single piece between them and your king. That's going to be a lot, and that's going to be really difficult without giving away material, trading pieces, or even just losing material. So because of that, having pieces defending your king is a surefire way to keep him protected for the oncoming battle. One of the best ways to protect your king really early on in the chess game is to castle. Now that's a new term. We haven't really talked about castling before. Now, I have mentioned it, and I showed it twice where I said we would come back to this, so now it's finally time. And I think you'll like castling, because it is the only move in a chess game where you get to move two pieces at once. For all of these other lessons I've been saying, you move one piece, your opponent moves one piece, and you take these turns moving one piece at a time. But castling is so much different. You get to move your king and your rook. You get to get your king to safety, and you get to get your rook into the game. Castling is such a strong move, both offensively and defensively. So that's why in the next part of this video, we're going to focus on castling so you know when to do it, how to do it, when you can do it, and everything else that you'll need to know about this amazing move. So to castle, the move happens between your king and your rook. What that means is the space between them will have to be clear. You'll take your king and you'll move him 2 squares to either side, to the left or to the right, and then your rook will hop over your king and go to the other side of it. Now, that's another thing you may be stopping and thinking about. You know that the only piece that can jump over other pieces is the knight. Not the bishop, not the queen, not the rook, not the pawn, not the king. Only the knight. But I just said that the rook can jump over the king. And yes, that is correct. That's how castling is such a cool move and can be pretty confusing at the beginning too. Your king, instead of only being able to move 1 square, now moves 2. Your rook, not being able to jump over pieces, now is able to. And that may be so confusing at the beginning, but just remember that it doesn't have to be, because this is the only move where this is actually possible. Apart from castling, your king sticks to its regular movement and your rook sticks to its regular movement as well. Let's move into the actual rules of how to castle to give you a better understanding of when you can do it. Here are some important rules to think about when deciding whether or not you can castle. Number 1, and arguably the most important one of them all. There cannot be any pieces in between your king and your rook. The space between your king and your rook have to be completely empty. Your pieces can't be on those squares, nor your opponent's pieces, because the king and the rook need freedom to move toward each other and onto those squares between them. Second, your king and your rook cannot have moved previously in the game. Even if you had moved your king to the side and then moved him back to his starting square, or likewise with your rook, castling would not be allowed. Castling is only possible if your king and your rook have not moved in the entire game. Third, you cannot castle when your king is in check. I'm not really sure why that's a rule, but it is, so we have to follow it. If your opponent is attacking your king directly, you cannot get out of check by castling. It may seem like that would be a great way to do so, but unfortunately it's just not allowed. You would have to prevent the check first, and only then would you be able to castle. And number 4, you can't castle through check. Now this one may seem a little odd, but similar to the last rule, you can't castle when you're in check. If your opponent is guarding one of the squares that your king will move through, so one of the 2 squares on either side of the board, if those are guarded by an enemy piece, you would technically be castling through check. As your king moves to one side or to the other, he would at one point be in check and be attacked. And you can't voluntarily put your king under attack because that would be considered an illegal move. So those are your 4 rules on whether or not you can castle. And if you're looking to see if you can do it in the game, you have to make sure your king and your rook haven't moved. You have to make sure the space between the 2 pieces are open. You have to make sure your king isn't in check. And you have to make sure enemy pieces aren't guarding the squares your king would go through. If all 4 of those are true, then you would be able to castle. I know I just threw a lot at you with 2 pieces being able to move, their movements being completely different and everything like that. But castling is such an important rule and move in chess that I'm gonna go show you some positions and have you try and figure out whether or not you can castle. Armed with your knowledge of these 4 rules, let's take a look at positions and see if you can find the correct answers. Let's go. So this is the first position that we'll look at to teach you how to castle and how to recognize when you can castle. We'll start with white in this position. We'll look at the king side and the queen side. So first, let's go through these 4 rules that need to be true so that you can castle. First, there cannot be any pieces between the king and the rook. If we look at the king side for white, there are no pieces between the white king and the white rook. So the first one is true. Second, both the king and rook have to be on their starting squares. So the king and the rook are on their starting squares, but there's a second part to that rule. They also cannot have previously moved. Since this is the first time you've seen this position, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that the white king, the white rooks, the black king, and the black rooks all have not moved in this game, which means rule number 2 will be true for all 4 situations. Number 3, the king cannot be in check. So if we look at white's king right now, there is no black piece that is currently putting the king in check. So that is true. And number 4, you can't castle through check. So we have to take a look at the f1 square and the g1 square and see if either of those squares are attacked by black pieces. If you take a look at the black pieces, none of them are pointing at the white king side. So that is also true. Because all 4 rules are true, white is able to castle on the king side, and this is a possible first move. But what about the queen side? So for rule number 1, you can see there are no pieces between the white king and the white rook on a1, so that is good. We already know that the king and rook have not moved, so rule number 2 is satisfied. We also know the king is not in check because we figured that out when we were looking at the king side, so that is correct. So the only thing we need to do to make sure white is able to castle on the queen side is to make sure that none of the squares the king moves through is attacked, So in that case, that would be the squares d1 and c1, because that would be the king moving through check if either of those squares are attacked. So let's take a look. The d1 square is not attacked by any black piece. But what about the c1 square? If we take a look at the bishop on a3, this is the only black piece near the white territory. And if we draw a line on its possible squares that it can move to, you can see that the bishop attacks the c1 square. What that means is that if white were to castle, if he were to move his king to c1 and the rook goes to d1, white would be castling through check, because on c1 his king would be attacked. What that means is that since only 3 out of the 4 rules are true, white is not able to castle on the queen side. All 4 rules are required to be true for you to be able to castle. So what we've just found is that white is able to castle on the king side, but not on the queen side. Let's take a look at black's position now. So we'll look at the king side once again, going through the same 4 rules. We can see that there are no black pieces between the king and the rook, so rule number 1 is true. We already know the black king and the black rook have not moved, so rule number 2 is true as well. The black king is not in check right now. There are no white pieces that are attacking the king, so rule number 3 is true. And for rule number 4, you can't castle through check. We can see that there are no white pieces that are guarding those 2 squares. You may recognize that the queen is on the same file as the g8 square, but since there's a pawn on g7, that blocks the queen's mobility to only being able to go to g7. Since this is not the g8 square, the black king is not castling through check, meaning all 4 rules are true and black is able to castle on the king side. That would be correct, and that would be a legal move. What about the queen side? We already can see that there are no black pieces between the king and the rook. The king and the rook have not moved. We know the king is not in check from before, and no white piece is attacking any of the squares between the king and the rook. Or more importantly, the d8 square and the c8 square, because those are the only 2 squares that the king moves through. Because of this, black is also able to castle on the queen side. So to conclude in this position, white is able to castle on the king side only, but black can castle on the king side and the queen side. That is position number 1 done. Now let's move on to position number 2. And in this one, I'm going to ask you to try and figure out what you think can happen here. Try to figure out which side both players can castle on. Start with white and then look at black. I'll give you a little bit of time because it may take a while to figure this out. And as a reminder, in this position as well, the white king and rooks and the black king and rooks have not moved in this game. Pause the video if you think you need more time. Alright, so if you think you got the answer, let's continue. We'll start for white in this position as well. Going through the same 4 rules, we can see there are no pieces between the king and the rook. The king and the rook have not moved. The king is not in check, and no black piece attacks the squares that the king moves through. So white is able to castle on the king side. What about on the queen side? The first 3 rules are all satisfied just as well. But now let's take a look at the 4th rule. You can't castle through check. You may see that this black bishop on f5 is looking along this diagonal near to where the king would castle. Does this make rule number 4 wrong? Or is white still able to castle? Here's a little tricky thing. Since you're looking at castling through check, you only need to focus on the king. which means the only two squares you need to care about are d1 and c1 in this case. Since the king does not move through the b1 square, it doesn't matter that the black bishop is attacking that square. The king will never go there, and therefore will never be attacked. Since d1 and c1 are both safe and are not attacked by any black piece, white is able to castle on the queen side as well. So in this position, white can castle on both sides of the board. Now what about black's perspective? Let's take a look at black trying to castle on the king side first of all. We know that there are no pieces between the king and the rook, and the king and the rook have not moved. The black king is not in check because although the queen is on the same file as it, we can see there's a knight on e7 that blocks the check. So the king is safe right now as well. As for castling through check, we have to look at the f8 and g8 squares to see if any white piece is guarding them. And if you saw the bishop on c4 pointing at the g8 square, then you would be correct in saying that black cannot castle on the king side. Since he would be castling through check, his king would go through this g8 square, he would be in check and this would be an illegal move. So black is not able to castle on the king side. What about the queen side? We know there are no pieces between the king and rook. The king and rook have not moved. The king is not in check. And if we take a look at the d8 and c8 squares, no white piece attacks these squares. Therefore, black is able to castle on the queen side. What that means is out of black's two choices, he can only castle on the queen side in this position. What I would like you to take away from these two examples is that this 4-rule process of asking yourself these is very important. Castling is a very important move. So this 4-rule process will help you determine whether or not you can get your king to safety. If one of these 4 rules are not true, then maybe your first thought or your first action over the next couple of moves would be to make that rule true. Either get your king out of check, get your piece out from being between the king and the rook, guard or block one of his pieces from attacking the squares that your king would move through, or any other thing that would help you get castled and get your king to safety. And in general, besides getting your king to safety, it also helps get your rook into the game. Remember that castling moves 2 pieces, so while you do get your king behind a wall of pawns, you'll also get your rook out of the corner and closer to the center of the board where it can be more useful in the incoming middle game. So that's it for castling. I hope you now understand how important this move is and how to do it. Let's go back to the main lesson. Now that we've discussed all of the pieces, I'd like to combine a lot of these strategies that we've been talking about in one example game.
Whoa. You can slow down a bit there, Pasladia. This guy's so excited to teach you stuff, he may just be forgetting something important. Let me kick him on out of here and explain to you guys what he may be missing. Alright, that's better. Hey guys, it's Future Ladia here. It's just me this time. You don't have to deal with that guy anymore. But what I want to tell you is that recently I've gotten some very helpful suggestions and constructive criticism in the comment section. Thank you for that, by the way. But one viewer mentioned that I should be focused on making my videos a little bit shorter than what I've been doing so far. And I was thinking about that, and that does make sense. At the beginning of your chess journey, there's going to be a lot of stuff thrown at you. And I know in these past 2 videos specifically, learning all about the opening in just 2 videos in about an hour and 20 minutes, that's going to be a lot of information just pushed into your brain. You know how the pieces move and all the basics, but now you have to figure out how to get them all out into the game, plan for the future, conduct an attack, protect your king. There are so many things. Chess is really difficult. So some people will understand this. Some people will be really confused. If you go back and rewatch the video, maybe it will be helpful again. Maybe you'll learn something new. But the thing is I want to help you learn chess the best and the easiest way you can. So with that said, if my material is going to be confusing, if there's just too much being piled on to you, having the videos a little shorter is actually a great idea. However, as you get stronger and stronger in your chess journey, you'll start to absorb all of this knowledge like a sponge. This chess information will be just like water to you. If you already think you're there, if that's how you feel with these videos, you're actually a lot stronger than you think. So with all of that said, we're actually going to end this video right here, because you already learned 2 really important strategies that you can use to better play the openings. Join us, I mean me, in the next video, where it'll be like a little half part 2 video where we're gonna look at this review game. I'll go over it with you and teach you all of the main things about why this game is so important. Until then, this is future LRJ Chess signing off with a checkmate. God, I really hope I'm not creating a multiverse of LRJ Chesses. One is already enough.